Hi, well, my name is Fernando Villena, and I am the director of Dear Writer.
My earliest positive memories were definitely about snow, not having to go to school, sledding. So I started the company in '77. I remember I went out with 38 snowboards and I came home with 40 because one dealer said, "I don't want this crap."
He said his name was Jake and he made snowboards. And I was like, oh, that's cute. He had this spark. He was so damn determined.
Once I just focused all of my energy and my love and my time into making it a sport, that's when everything sort of started to work.
Snowboarding made this transition from something that people were afraid of to something that people embraced.
33 million people watched Shaun White win the Olympic gold medal.
Snowboarding just exploded.
Where would my life be today without Jake? He was always there to support and back me. He wanted to get 100 days every year.
How am I going to say slow down? Jake could look at us and say, you guys need to speed up.
He's really the badass grandpa of snowboarding.
Snowboarding was that light that drove him.
Surfing on snow. From the very beginning, I was passionate about it. In the back of my mind, I always knew it could be a sport.
That is a trailer from the documentary Dear Writer, and this is Factual America. We're brought to you by Alamo Pictures, an Austin and London-based production company making documentaries about America for international audiences. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. This week it is my pleasure to welcome the award-winning filmmaker Fernando Villena, the director of the documentary Dear Writer. The film tells the inspirational story of how Jake Burton Carpenter, the man who pioneered the sport of snowboarding, took a favorite childhood toy and developed it into an international cultural phenomenon. Fernando, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Hi, Matthew. Things are really, really great. Thank you for having me.
That's great to hear. Just to remind our listeners, the film is Dear Writer. It's released this year, produced by Red Bull Media House, out now in North America on HBO Max, and will be releasing through Universal in Europe and the UK in early 2022. So, Fernando, why don't you get us started and tell our listeners, what is Dear Writer all about? Maybe you can give us a quick synopsis.
Well, Dear Writer is the story of Jake Burton Carpenter, who is the pioneer of snowboarding, one of the pioneers of snowboarding. He is, as quick, I haven't been asked this question very much, like tell us the synopsis. So
Yeah.
So let me work through it. He's, it's a classic entrepreneur story.
Yeah.
It's like goes back to those guys that American entrepreneur spirit in the 70s where people actually made stuff. And but what was interesting about Jake is that at 12 years old he fell in love. Well, before then he fell in love with the ocean. He fell in love with this idea of surfing, right? But he lived in Long Island and he would vacation in the winters in Vermont, and he was introduced to the Snurfer, which is this little toy. It's like this little, I forget, something like a $10 toy. And it was just like this piece of wood with a rope on it. And as soon as he got on it, like his mind just exploded. And he was like, oh my God, I can actually surf on snow. And that became his obsession. And that, along with making a lot of money. Right. So by the time he tried his hand at Wall Street, it wasn't working out. And then, he figured, he needed a get rich quick scheme. And he was like, that toy from when I was a kid, that thing, that's a sport. That can be a sport. And I think that's the key to me getting wealthy, right? And so that's what he did. He started up this company and he made a bunch of prototypes. Took him about a year, made 100 prototypes, and finally came out with his first snowboard. And then, as the story goes, it was very rough going from there.
But like you say, it's the classic American entrepreneur story. I mean, you can go even further back. He's straight out of Thomas Edison or those types, I would say cut of the same cloth, and he was very hands-on, wasn't he? And he, you've got scenes of him actually in the workshop, really, working on each board and each prototype. So very classic in that sense, a very classic American story. But maybe you can give us a context, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are younger. Snowboarding's been around as long as they know. I mean, give us the context of how groundbreaking he really was.
I mean, you got to go back to the late 70s, like 1977, right? There was no internet. There weren't any chat groups or anything like that, right? So he's in the Northeast, and he's trying to make this toy into like a real sport, this hobby into a real sport. So he's up there doing it in Vermont, which is, I don't know how well your listeners know about the topography in the U.S., but like in Vermont, the snow is hard and icy and wet.
Yeah.
Colorado, it's soft and beautiful and fluffy and super deep, right? So he's trying to develop snowboards in this rougher environment, right? And he initially, very early on, he figured out that we need to get on the resorts, right? We need to get snowboarding on the resorts, and so I think more than anything, Jake was responsible for getting the sport on the resorts in that period in the 80s, which wasn't hard, they had a ton of pushback, right? Yeah. Like skiers just weren't having it. They weren't into snowboarders. They weren't into snowboard. They weren't into sharing their mountain with snowboarders, but he persisted and he was resilient. And, there were other people doing it. There were other people doing it on the West Coast. And what's funny is when the East Coast and the West Coast, when Jake finally, when the worlds collided, if you will, Jake had a rival in the West Coast, and his name's Tom Sims. And through that rivalry, the sport really developed, really exploded. Not just in style, because the West Coast was very more freestyle and creative in that sense, and the East Coast was kind of more in the downhill skiing tradition, but also in how technology just like evolved exponentially during that time. But Jake was always at the forefront, right? And the thing that separated Jake from the others was he had a tremendous business sense, right? Being an entrepreneur, and he was just able to combine his passion for the sport, for making snowboarding a sport, along with his resiliency and need to win, and also his business sense. And coming out of the 80s, Jake was on top.
Yeah. I mean, I'm originally from Texas, and they say if Texans were meant to ski, they'd have made bullshit white. But I did do enough skiing to know an early sort of 90s period, and this is when snowboarding really was starting to take off, as you document in the film. And I just remember that reaction. You had your traditional skiers who are like, who are these guys who are taking up all our slopes and nearly knocking me down while I'm trying to go, and all this bad press that they had. So, but he did. I mean, I think, as you said, he's this entrepreneur. I mean, he's like a Steve Jobs character, isn't he? Because it's not just innovation, and it's like the ultimate example of disruption, isn't it? And then making a product and that people didn't realize they wanted or needed, but and then creating this sport absolutely practically from scratch. I mean, as you point out, there were others. There was the West Coast, and other people had been looking at this, but his drive was in doing this was incredible.
He saw it as a sport, and I think that's where the difference lies.
Yeah.
Is that Jake loved competition. He loved sports. He loved the Giants. He loved the Celtics. He loved the Rangers. Right.
Yeah.
He was passionate about sports, and he loved the competitive side of it, and he loved the competitive side of snowboarding. Maybe if Jake hadn't come along, snowboarding would still be around, but it would be more of a hobby, right? It would be more of something that's done in the backcountry. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But Jake put everything he had into making it a sport, and in very short order, it's in the Olympics.
Yeah.
And it becomes this just kind of global phenomenon. But he saw something that wasn't there. And I think when you speak about Steve Jobs, people like that, entrepreneurs like that, they see things that aren't there, and they envision things that people they don't even know that they want, but when they hear about it, they're gonna really want it, right? Whether it's an iPhone or a snowboard. But he changed winter in a lot of ways. He changed winter sports. And it's an incredible legacy, the legacy of having fun.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what you in your film, I think I do remember I think it was one of his sisters stressing that the one thing their dad stressed was being passionate about something. And there's that element too. He was passionate about, like you said, this early beginnings, fell in love with the ocean, surfing, snow. He talks eloquently about how he fell in love with snow, and then this. So he just had this, and he was, as you said, he tried Wall Street, and it just wasn't working for him in that sense. And he did have this passion, and he followed it. But I think, as you're pointing out, I mean, this whole cultural awareness he had, what he tapped into that others didn't see, this sort of nonconformist. He's a baby boomer, but he's this nonconformist, Gen Xers, now millennials. He's a brilliant marketer, isn't he? It's like art meets sports meet alt culture. I mean, it's just incredible, this whole thing that he tapped into. And
in those early days, he had his hands in everything. In the design of the boards, and the graphics on the boards, and the marketing. He would send out the brochures. He would write the intros to the brochures. And he did everything, right? And what were you saying in the beginning of that? Because I wanted to follow up on.
Well, they're just tapping into this culture, this market.
No, initially, Jake thought that the people who were going to buy his boards were going to be 25 and 30-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
People kind of his age, 25, 35. Yeah. Maybe guys that grew up with the Snurfer and knew what that was. But very early on, he realized that the people who were buying snowboards were 14, 15 years old.
Yeah.
And that was his core audience, right? His buyers, right? And he adjusted. And that's what he always did. He always adjusted. And it was like, wow, the future of snowboarding isn't downhill racing. It's freestyle. He made a correction. He always corrected, and I think that gave him the ability to keep up and always be innovative.
I mean, I think that's a great example, and it's kind of a hilarious scene in some ways. The scenes of his team showing up in these sort of aerodynamic suits, like downhill racers, and then running into the West Coast guys who are like had their little whole,
Were way cooler,
definitely way cooler. Those other guys look like something straight out of a comedy, really.
Yeah. And I think Jake spent a lot of time with Ben Bryan from Red Bull Media House putting this film together while he was alive, right? Maybe over a year, doing the timelines, doing the research. And, one of the things that Jake wanted and was important to him is that, the whole story be told. He goes, I didn't invent snowboarding, right?
Yep.
And I wasn't the only guy out there, and I wasn't always right. Like it all has to, we're going to tell the story. We should tell like the story in its entirety. And it's funny, and I love it because in a lot of the 80s, Jake is kind of like you know, he's in a lot of ways catching up to other people who are have maybe a bit more like the innovation of their boards and their design is maybe a little bit ahead of Burton. So Burton's catching up, and especially in the culture, right? Like you said, these guys show up in speed suits in like onesies, right? With
Exactly.
like giant gloves and these giant helmets, and the dudes from the West Coast are like in t-shirts and jeans.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think to Jake, it was obvious from pretty early on that freestyle was the future.
I mean, what do you want? One thing then, because I do want to talk more about how the project came about and Red Bull's involvement and things. But one thing that strikes me, I don't know if you're familiar with Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog, but it's very similar. We had a doc on about that a while back, but it's very similar to that. He did something similar, an annual catalog that would go in, that he would write this letter, and that's how he created this huge sort of underground movement. Now for him it stayed relatively underground, but for Jake, I mean hence where Dear Writer comes from, right? The title of the film is this annual letter that he would send to his. But his ability to create this connection is amazing to me, with not just snowboarders, just general public, but also the professionals as well, who really quite a sense of loyalty to him for all that he did for them. Because I mean, I guess you think about it, if he hadn't been one of the creators of this sport, what would they have done? He created a sport that then made them who they are. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, I think connection for Jake was everything.
Yeah.
Connecting to his riders, connecting to his friends, to his family. And ultimately, I'm not a snowboarder, so I was embraced by this community while I was making the film. And they really are a community. Like, I don't think, like, unlike most sports, it feels like a community. It feels like one giant extended family. And I think, I don't know, but Burton's like that. They have that kind of family vibe, and Donna's and Jake's kids. They guide that company, and they put their influence on it. And of course Jake did, and Jake always led the way, and he was kind of like the Pied Piper, like the cruise director of that whole crew, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, for him it was connection, and that it's funny because that's when I first got on the project. That was my in, was how he needed to be connected during the Miller Fisher disease. Yeah.
I think that takes us to a good point to just give our audience a quick break. But we'll be right back with Fernando Villena, the editor and director of Dear Writer, produced by Red Bull Media House, out now in North America on HBO Max, and releasing through Universal in Europe and the UK in early 2022. If you enjoy Factual America, check out the Movie Maker podcast. That's all one word, Movie Maker, where our friends at moviemaker.com interview everyone from filmmakers just breaking in to A-listers like David Fincher and Edgar Wright about their movie-making secrets and behind-the-scenes tricks of the trade. They go deep and let the guests speak uninterrupted to get you the most film insight. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with award-winning director Fernando Villena. The film's Dear Writer, recently released. It's produced by Red Bull Media House. It's out in North America on HBO Max. And for those in Europe and the UK, you'll be able to see it. It's being released by Universal in early 2022. Fernando, we've been talking about Jake Burton Carpenter, obviously the pioneer, snowboarding pioneer. Anyone watching this most likely knows that Jake is no longer with us. And so we've been talking about his life, but I think one thing that comes out, and you were mentioning this before the break, how you got started with this, with his illness. He fought death as hard as he played, didn't he? I mean, that
Yeah.
certainly comes out loud and clear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He
And
had a passion for living. Like,
yeah.
it's articulated in the little bird story in the film, but he had a tremendous passion for living.
Yeah. Cancer. What was this? He had this rare disease. I mean, this was just incredible. What was that he had?
The disease is Miller-Fisher syndrome, which is it's horrible. It's
yeah, indeed.
It causes paralysis in the body, blindness. You're essentially locked in, right?
Yeah.
But the thing about it is that you do recover from it. You know, you recover from it, but they don't know how long that recovery is going to take. But meanwhile, the person is locked in their body, but their mind is fine. Their mind is functioning fine, which sounds super terrifying. But in Jake's case, he could still move his hand, right? He could move one hand, so he was able to communicate with that one hand. And it was that need to connect, that need to communicate, which really inspired me, you know, in the very, very beginning, because I didn't know who Jake was when I first heard about the project. And I put together a proof of concept before I met Jake for the interview. And a lot of that proof of concept was based on him and him needing to communicate while he had Miller-Fisher through those note cards.
Yeah, and you've got, so I guess they saved all there's stacks and stacks of these note cards, aren't there?
There's hundreds and hundreds. Yes.
So I mean, that you were kind of mentioning it earlier. So how did this project come about? You said he was already orchestrating or helping with this even before his death.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes. For like a year and a half, he was working with Ben Bryan and to, you know, figure out what it was going to be like, what they were going to cover, doing the timelines. I had worked with Ben on another film. He hired me to direct my first film, which is Any One of Us. And while we were in the finishing stages of that film, Ben told me about the Burton film, about Jake's story. And I didn't know who Jake was, but he told me, look, if you're interested, we can definitely interview with Jake. But there's going to be a lot of other directors interviewing as well. So I knew that the only way I had a shot was to actually show Jake something, right? Because I had nothing. My movie hadn't even come out yet. Yeah. I couldn't just like charm him into working with me, right? So I shot something. So I did a bunch of research and I reenacted a few scenes and I shot a 7-minute proof of concept, which when I met Jake, I did show him. So I met Jake for 20 minutes in our interview. And he was like he is in the movie. He was very generous, kind, you know, trying to make me feel comfortable, right? And then we had this great session. But leaving, I realized I thought, I'm not really connected. I don't know if I connected with Jake yet.
Right.
So as I was leaving the interview, I looked at him and I was like, you know, Jake, if we did this together, we'd have a lot of fun, right?
Yeah.
And then he looked at me like a bit sideways, and I looked back at him. And I was like, I just blew that. And then I was like, all right, well, look, lovely to meet you. And I left, and he did choose another director at that time, right? But the funny thing is, I didn't know about have as much fun as possible at that point. I didn't realize that was like his main theme, right? It's just something that came to me. I was like, we'd have a lot of fun together because I really felt it because he was so awesome, like just such a good guy, right? And he was really moved by what he saw. So I was like, yeah, we'd have a lot of fun. Well, what happened was like months later, towards the end of 2019, the first director had to drop out, and so they were going to open up the selection process again. Yeah. But then Jake got sick, like very soon after, right? And you know, he passed a few weeks after right after his first chemo treatment. So we had to, you know, they were, the family and Red Bull and HBO were wondering whether the movie was still going to go on, but the family decided that the film should go on because that's what Jake wanted.
Yeah.
Right. So at that point, instead of opening up the process to more interviews, the family chose me, to direct the film, and based off that 20-minute meeting, because Jake wanted an established director to tell the story, and I totally understood that, but he was still trying to figure out a way for me to be involved.
Wow.
But I didn't want to be involved in any capacity, but as a director, so I declined. But Jake passed towards late November 2019, and by January 2020, we were in Colorado with the family, myself and the family, and talking about the new creative, how we were going to tell the story now. And the thing that came out of that meeting was we're going to tell the story in Jake's words as much as possible, and Jake's going to narrate his story as much as possible. But at that point, it was January 2020, and we came up with this whole new creative that then we had to completely redo again a month and a half later when everything shut down.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite an amazing story. I mean, an example of how Jake, he's made a difference in a lot of people's lives, and obviously made a difference in your life as well. And I mean, so with COVID hitting, and so you have to decide to tell the story a little differently. I mean, how much different is this film than what it would have been if COVID hadn't happened?
Way different. Yeah. Way different. We were going to travel a bunch. We were going to go to Chile and Austria, like all the big spots, right? Yeah. We were going to go to Vermont.
Yeah.
And it was still going to be an archive film, but it wasn't going to be so much of an archive film.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, what we did was, like end of March, I was talking to our producers, and I was like, we need to come up with a plan that we can make a movie, right? We can make this movie and not leave our homes until we're finished.
Right.
And they're like, well, what do you mean? And like, I just don't know how long this is gonna go. I mean, it could go for months and months, and like, I don't think we should be planning on trips and then not being able to, to pull them off, and then we have to figure something else out in 3 or 4 months. So we decided to just like go deep into the archive and make it even more of an archive film than we had initially planned, right? But here's the other thing that came out of it is that now we had more money for music.
Right.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And I love our soundtrack.
I do too.
Jonathan Heck, who put it together, music supervisor, he just went above and beyond what needed to be done to get these songs in our film. And I could work 20 more years. I don't know if I'll ever have a soundtrack. But it was because they weren't going to travel. You know?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was going to ask you, or was this a challenge? I mean, you come to this not as a snowboarder yourself, so that has its benefits and its challenges, I imagine, especially working with this community. But what are the challenges of making a film about such, not just as such an iconic individual, but such a high adrenaline sport, and you've got to live up to those high energy standards that I think snowboarding has set, and the cultural side, which is the music, which is why I've got it written down here to ask you about the music. I mean, that's that's quite a ask, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, I think, and especially like not being a snowboarder, you mean?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I did have snowboarders. I mean, most of our core creative group was made up of snowboarders. Yeah. So I ironically was the only one who wasn't. Yeah. Right. So Rose Core, who edited the film and is just incredibly gifted, is also a gifted snowboarder. Ben Bryant snowboarded since he was a kid. So they all very much plugged into that community. But for me, I think I actually prefer not to know anything about a subject while I'm working on it, because I have no bias, I have no prejudices. I have and it just sparks my curiosity even more than normal. So I like look everywhere, you know, and ways to interpret, ways to understand. So a lot of times the film ends up being me figuring out what this is all about, right? As opposed to me telling you what it is.
Yeah.
You know, because the cool thing about the last 3 weeks since the movies come out is that we've had a lot of snowboarders, a lot of old school Burton guys, a lot of old school people that have just been snowboarding since the 80s come up to us and tell us, we learned so much watching that film. Can't believe how much we learned. I thought I knew the whole story. There was stuff in there I never even heard about. You know, and like that part of it really makes me happy, because it's a testament to how all of us just dug in, and we're just like, let's just keep digging and digging and digging and digging, and let's get the best stuff, and let's find the best stories. Let's connect all the dots. But I also think, like, you know, I edited for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So I have a good editorial sense in that respect. I know. I mean, I think my instincts are good when it comes to pace and rhythm and style and these things. And I knew the Dear Writer sections in the film needed to be a little extra, right? They needed to have a little bit more juice.
Yeah.
And so I brought in a big gun for that. This is an editor called Doobie White, who's one of my oldest friends and a phenomenal editor, but he can do some crazy stuff, right? And I'm like, I need these 3 scenes to just really just like pop, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Be able to bring that.
Well, that's when you said big gun, I thought you were also going to talk about Woody Harrelson.
Well, that was the biggest of all the guns, right? yeah. Well, what happened? Well, see, what happened was, you know, when we first started editing, you know, like early days. I'm talking about like March, maybe not even April. I'm like still in March, and Rose is on, and so we're talking, and we're just like, what about this? What about that? And then so I'm talking to her, and I'm like, you know, these catalogs are really interesting.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, the ones his intros. I'm like, yeah, there's something there. And then she's like, well, what are you thinking? I'm like, well, what if we just string them out throughout the piece, and Jake narrates the rise of snowboarding in these little sections, right? Because that's what he's doing in the catalogs.
Yeah.
He's like telling people, you know, snowboarding, where snowboarding is at that particular time in the history. So we were working that out, and at the same moment, I think one of us said, you know, he always says "Dear Writer" in the beginning, and at the same moment, we both were like, is that the title of the film?
Yeah.
Like, that might be the title of the film. And so we just and then we knew that Woody Harrelson was a friend of Jake's, and he was on the interview list, but I just didn't want to interview him as a celebrity like subject, right? But as soon as we thought of the Dear Writer, you know, sections, he was the first person that came to mind, right? Yeah. And he was, you know, generous enough to do it.
Well, he's extremely generous, because I think this may be the second, if not the third, doc that we've had on that he's had narration. So we know what he was doing during the pandemic. He was narrating documentaries, basically. But again, but it's a similar story. The one set of filmmakers we had, indeed, they just somehow they had this connection to him and called him up, and he said, "Yeah, sure, man, no problem. You know, I'll narrate your doc." I mean, it's just so he sounds like a very generous soul in that way.
He is. He's super generous, but he also knew Jake. Yeah. And partied with Jake. And and so he knew the man, right?
Yeah.
He knew the man. And I think Woody just a phenomenal job of helping us connect to those words. And by the end of the last couple of Dear Writers, where they get a little bit more kind of, they're about something more than snowboarding. They're about his personal life.
Right.
Like at that point, he's just channeling Jake.
Yeah.
You know, and it's so great because it's not a long. They're not long narrations, but they're very powerful.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think you're right about making. I mean, if you told people in a proof of concept or something that you're going to read sections of a catalog, and it's going to be an interesting, documentary. But they do pop. There are just some incredible scenes. Some of that footage. I mean, it's. I'm not a snowboarder myself, but I'm wishing I had become one because it looks like amazing fun.
Yeah, those scenes.
Yeah.
Those scenes when you play them in audiences during the film, people clap.
Yeah, yeah.
People clap after those scenes. You know, that's the only time they clap in the movie. During the movie, right?
Yeah.
After each one, I think it's a combination of how cool those scenes are, but the music and everything, but also more importantly, like Jake. It's like Jake talking to the audience.
Yeah.
Right. And people get really they respond to it for sure.
And what's it like working with Red Bull? I mean, this is your second documentary with them, is that right?
This is my second documentary as a director, but I've worked with them, on other projects.
Okay.
Like on the editorial side. I love them. I love them. I didn't even know they made movies.
Well, that's what I was. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I didn't even know they made movies until I got somebody suggested they hire me to do a polish on a film called The Fourth Phase, which was a big epic snowboarding adventure film, snowboarder. So they go all around the world, traveling, chasing winter, right?
Yeah.
And then Ben and I just formed this really strong bond working on that film. And during the making of that film, he was like, "Well, we have this other project, which is more of it's about a mountain biker who suffers a spinal cord injury, and it's more of it's like self-shot, so basically an archive film, hardly any shooting to be done." So I was like, I'm in, I'll do it, and it was such a great experience, and that small film turned into a bigger film, right? And we explored bigger themes than we initially had in mind, and it did very, very well. It got picked up by HBO, and but Red Bull, they're just very supportive of your creative kind of ideas, of your creative intuition, especially Ben and his team, and they do things differently than like
I
a
imagine.
normal production company,
Yeah,
right? But I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. It feels like they want to put all the money up on the screen, and they want it to look. They want the film to be as good as it can possibly be. And I don't think that's always the case in my 20 years of experience, right? But with them, it is, and it's such a pleasure, and it really is fun to work with those guys.
And is that how you moved into directing? Because as you were saying, you had this extensive editor experience, and then it's through with them that they again allowed your creativity to move. You were able to move into directing.
Absolutely. Ben gave me my first shot. He gave me my first break, and it had been something that I had been wanting to do for a while.
Yeah.
20 years of editing is a long time. It's a long time. And you're basically in a dark, windowless room, and
that's what I hear. Yep.
yeah, exactly. So by the time I was in my mid 40s, I was like, all right, I'm kind of done.
Yeah.
I'm kind of done with that, and but I didn't really know how to make the transition because I'm in LA. A lot of everybody wants to direct in LA, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, how am I going to do that? And then Ben gave me my shot. He gave me my shot. He gave me a chance, and he supported me throughout that whole process, even in the very early days of that project where I really felt like I didn't know what was going on. He was like super calm and just teaching me the ropes.
Okay. And what's next for you in terms of projects?
Well, right now I'm directing a new project for HBO.
Okay.
It's about the life of Oscar De La Hoya, the boxer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. It's super fun. And we're just getting started, but it's a big story.
Yeah.
It's like a family it's a family drama, really, you know.
Yeah.
It's a family that suffered a great loss when Oscar's mom died when he was 17.
Yeah.
And it's really, as much as it is about boxing, it's about how that family has endured the last 25 years.
Oh, wow. Well, if we haven't frightened you off, when that's done, we'd love to have you back on again to discuss that one. Yeah, that'd be great. And I think we're coming to the end of our time together, but before I let you go, are you an artist? Is that your studio behind you?
This is my wife's art. Yeah. Her name is Flor Quinto. She's wonderful. I did go to art school, but I don't make art anymore. This is her stuff. And it's the coolest room in the house, so that's why I always do my stuff from here.
Okay, no, I was going to say it's looking very cool. I was going to have you maybe give us a tour of all your artwork, but we'll have to give our compliments to her because I think it looks great. I would love to have a room like that in my house. So
I'll do that. She'll be happy.
Hey, well, Fernando, thank you so much for being on the Factual America podcast. It's been a joy having you on. It's just to remind our listeners and viewers that we've been talking with Fernando Villena, director of Dear Rider, produced by Red Bull Media House, out now in North America on HBO Max, and releasing through Universal in Europe and the UK in early 2022. Fernando, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate it.
So I'd like to give a big shout out to Sam and Joe at Inner Sound Audio in Eskirk, England. And a big thanks to Nevena Paunovic, our podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who ensures we continue getting such great guests like Fernando onto the show. Finally, a big thanks to our listeners. As always, we love to hear from you, so please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas, whether it is on YouTube, social media, or directly by email. And please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.